It's not uncommon to come to a point where we're not sure which way to go. Should I change careers? Should I move? Am I supposed to stay in this relationship? How should I be relating to my teenager? How should I deal with this loss? Is this all there is to my life? Considering the import and the impact of these questions, we can wish that we had a kind of spiritual GPS, a global positioning system for the spirit, a device into which we could type, "My promised land," or "Find my purpose," or "Discover my bliss," or "Show me the way to true fulfillment." And it would provide us with a few possible routes to get us where we need to go. And then, once we set off toward our goal, if and when we make a mistake or take a wrong turn, it would help us recalibrate our route. And no matter how many wrong turns or missteps we made, it would correct us in a completely non-judgmental voice. Recalibrating? Recalibrating again. No worries, just recalibrating. I'm not frustrated. No, this is what I do. Recalibrating again now. Now, I don't know about yours, but my GPS seems to have a little attitude sometimes. I mean, maybe I'm projecting, but when I get frustrated, it seems like she gets a little frustrated too. The thing is that we are so used to Googling for answers these days and having them right at our fingertips that it can seem excruciatingly slow to have to pray or sit in meditation or go on retreat in order to discern the next steps for our life. Finding our spiritual GPS is an interesting metaphor for those times when we feel like we're lost in the wilderness or wandering in the desert. We are often thrust into these wilderness experiences through life circumstances, like when a loved one dies, or we face some trauma or tragedy or diagnosis or a breakup or some other loss. A young man came to see me. He had just been diagnosed with a degenerative disease similar to multiple sclerosis. Up until that point, his life was all about work. He was a salesman. He played on a soccer team. He was in a relationship. And when he was diagnosed and he came to see me, he'd never really considered a lot of the deeper questions and feelings about the possibility of being incapacitated in this life or of dying young. I just always imagined I would get married and have children. Now I wonder what my life is about, especially if none of that ever happens. Bill was thrown into having to navigate some huge questions about meaning and purpose, while also dealing with making endless doctor's appointments and educating himself about his disease and trying to keep his head above water at work, not to mention in the rest of his life. It was situations like Bill's that made me realize how hard it is to develop a spiritual life in the midst of major life crises and events. And this is what inspired us here at All Souls to start offering spiritual themes each month. These themes provide signposts, tools, and equipment for navigating the most meaningful questions in our lives. The idea is that instead of waiting until we are in the midst of a crisis, when we're overwhelmed and vulnerable and confused, our church helps us to fill our toolbox with spiritual competencies and ancient wisdoms and helpful practices and stories that we can have at our disposal for those times when we do find ourselves out in the wilderness. It's about building skills before we find ourselves in spiritual, personal, or emotional deserts. Now, how it worked in my life was that when my daughter Sienna died suddenly and unexpectedly, that same year at church, we had been talking about themes such as faith and death and brokenness and transformation. So I had spent the months leading up to this incredible tragedy, talking with and listening to and studying questions of faith and about death and how loss impacts our lives. I had heard people from this church tell stories of times of great brokenness and how they overcame them and ultimately transformed them into something of value for themselves and for the world. So when I was suddenly thrust into this time of deep despair and confusion, and I was having to grapple with these intense issues of faith and death, I had in my bank of experience a wealth of stories about how many people in this community had overcome losses in their lives. Through small group meetings and classes and sermons, I had come to know that even the worst situations are survivable, and that in time, such painful experiences can even be transformed into new forms of love and compassion and wisdom. It was as if, while I was navigating this dark night of the soul experience, I was carrying with me stories and wisdom from many of you, and in that way, you were carrying me through this dark night. One of the purposes of religion is to provide us with the tools so that we can be intentional and healthy and courageous in making the most important decisions in our life. That said, our religion and our spiritual path is not our GPS. It is only part of our GPS. You see, there are three mechanisms that make a global positioning system work. There are also three components to a spiritual GPS. There's the receiver, there's the transmitters, and there's the ground equipment. The receiver in our spiritual GPS, of course, is us. But it needs to be connected to the entire system or else it's useless. Just like some GPS unit that's not connected. Some people think that they are the whole system. Some people think that they are the creator, designer, chief, and captain of their entire destiny. But we are all part of incredible networks, from psychological and cultural to geographic and climactic to economic and political. So to think that we are in charge of our lives completely is to be lost. In a traditional GPS, there are transmitters, which are satellites that determine our position by determining where we are in relation to other positions. Now, in the spiritual sense, we could call this transmitting part of the system the Spirit, or truth, or God, or higher power, or for the naturalists, we might call it the interconnected web of all existence. The point is that we are part of and connected to something much bigger than ourselves, and if we are going to know where we are and how we relate to the whole, we need to be able to pay attention to the information that's being given to us about our place in the family of things. In other words, there are forces beyond our control that are influencing us and the direction of our life. And just as there are people who err on the side of thinking that they are the only necessary component of their guidance system, there are also people who tend to think that the transmitting part of the system is the only really important part. They say things like, God is in charge of everything. And sometimes they will use that as an excuse for their own bad behavior and bad choices. Some people will hide their irresponsibility behind the idea that, well, God is in control, and therefore whatever happens, it's not really my fault. They don't want to acknowledge that the GPS of life is not just one way. There is a transmitting part of the system, call it the spirit of life, call it the interconnected events of the universe, call it higher power. And there is the receiver, who is us. And both of these have a role to play in the events of our lives. People sometimes think that the universe or God alone will direct them, but they forget that they need to also put energy into figuring out what they need to do to be receivers. There are signs all around us every day, and our job is to know how to recognize them. It begins by figuring out what we're doing that's keeping us from being able to read the signs that are trying to tell us where we are in all of this and where we need to go. There are so many things that block us from unresolved grief, selfishness and narcissism. Addictions are a big one these days. They keep us from being able to read the signs or read them appropriately. Let me just say, too, that yoga and spiritual practices can be as much of an addiction as alcoholism, gambling, sex, and pornography. These things can become just another form of pain avoidance when they're used that way. Our fear of emotional pain, our fear of rejection, our fear of failure, all of these are ways that we block up the reception from this, what I'm calling spiritual GPS. But it's not just as simple as saying, okay, I'll face my pain and I'll face my fears. Because if we're going to embrace emotional pain and fear and walk that tightrope, we cannot do it without a net of some kind. So what's your net? Do you have resources to face your pain, trauma, fear, sorrow, and deepest longings? Do you have a community that's strong enough and wise enough? Do you have a small group of trusted friends? Do you have some practices such as meditation or prayer, dance, music, jogging, or other tools that help you to do one of the most important things we have to do in this life, and that is to transmute or transform our anger, our heartbreak, our fears, and our other strong emotions into something life-giving. To transmute these difficult emotions that we all feel that a lot of times we try to push away, but they're trying to teach us something and tell us something. We need to receive them and learn how to transfer them into something like love. Do you have practices that inspire you when you're feeling depleted and deflated and down? And do you have practices that can calm and cool you when you are feeling too hot with hatred or destructive feelings? We need these kinds of practices in order to have a fully functioning GPS receiver. But let's say you do have the capacity to sit with pain and other difficult emotions. And let's say you do have a network of people who can hold you through a scary night. And let's say that you do have practices that help to calm you and inspire you and lift you and humble you. Then the question is, do you make time to receive? In other words, do you ever turn on your GPS? Do you sit quietly enough to hear what your heart or your spirit or your God is trying to tell you? Can you put down your smartphone or beer bottle or compulsive cleaning habit long enough to hear the voice within you? If not, then that's the place to begin. Create more time to listen, to sit quietly. For some, this requires a full-blown retreat, some extended period of time away from your life and busyness and all the things that you do. And for others, it just requires setting aside 15 to 20 minutes every morning. But that's not all there is to a working spiritual GPS. Let's say you have the ability to sit with pain, your own and others, without fleeing. And let's say you have practices that help you to transmute and transform your pain and fear into love and hope and action. And let's say you make time in your life to listen to the Spirit and to pay attention to the inner voice that guides you. Then the final component that's needed is what a traditional GPS calls its ground system. You need to have a way to discern whether what you're hearing is coming from a holy or healthy place or from a demonic or destructive place. You see, even traditional GPS systems or satellites sometimes go on the blink. And when they do, they start to send inaccurate information. So there's a network of systems on the ground that help to monitor the satellites and their signals. And when one is off for any reason, it's marked unhealthy while it's being fixed, so that GPS receivers all over the world will not take that information from these broken satellites and end up getting people lost. Our spiritual GPS also requires a ground system that can help us know when the signals that we're receiving are unhealthy or unhelpful. A person I knew who I'll call Sam was a sex addict. He was married, he had children, but he could not live with integrity and honesty. He came to church and he did yoga. He took time to meditate and he took time to listen every morning. But listening to the Spirit inside of him, he often heard it telling him to stray from his marriage for the good of his marriage. The problem is, that was not the Spirit of love and life directing him. It was his addictive personality. The addiction itself was sending Sam messages that something was wrong, but he was picking up the wrong message. Not that it was the addiction masking something else that he needed to work with, but he was following the path of that addiction. In other words, not all yearnings are the same. Not all yearnings are where we need to go, but they are trying to teach us something that we need to learn from. Now, this example with Sam is pretty intense, but in smaller and larger ways, we all need help discerning whether the stirrings of our hearts and our intuition and our longings are coming from something healthy or something harmful. In the reading that I read earlier, author Tamma Keeves talks about her inner needs. She finally realized, in her case, that her inner needs were not self-destructive, bad, or shameful. They were not naughty or irresponsible and frivolous. That was important for her to realize that so she could move in the direction she needed to in her life. Sometimes the signals that we're getting are telling us to run or telling us to jump or telling us to stay put, and we need to have trusted people who we can consult to help us know whether that's the right direction. I call these people our spiritual elders, no matter how old they happen to be. They are wise. Most importantly, they have our best interest at heart, and they usually don't tell us what to do, but they ask us questions to help us test what we're feeling and what we're hearing. When someone comes to tell me that I'm feeling like changing careers, I'm feeling called to leave what I'm doing and take a completely new direction in my life, despite my training, despite my success, and I ask them, what's motivating you? Is it coming from an ego need to be recognized in a new way? Or is it coming from a fear of not being seen? Or is it coming from a deep love and hope for something much larger than personal gratification? Something much larger than insecurity or narcissistic tendencies or unresolved grief or untreated depression. The idea is that these kinds of probing questions can help us discern what the voice is saying and can help us to recalibrate and reroute as needed. If we're feeling a strong desire for change, something needs to change. What's important is getting clear and making sure that we're changing the right things. Fortunately, like a traditional GPS, the spiritual GPS is available to everyone, everywhere in the world, regardless of weather. Our job is to receive the signs and the signals that come to us in dreams and in phone calls and in the stirrings of our hearts. And we need to have a ground system of trustworthy and wise people who we can confide in. Now, whether you call that transmitting system the Spirit of life or the web of existence or God, for it to work, you have to be able to acknowledge that you are part of something much larger than yourself, and you have to know that this larger system is constantly sending you information about your place in the family of things. Mostly, you have to know that you have a place and you have a purpose. And if you do not feel that you are living it, recalibrate, recalibrate, recalibrate. Your GPS was designed to help you to get where you're meant to go. Use it. Or you might find yourself wandering aimlessly in the desert all alone. Amen.